ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the show for this evening. We have a little bit of a different show for tonight. We're going to go through an overview of Sunday's upcoming presentation, which is in relation to Pfizer's corporate rap sheet. So on this show, we're going to just have a little bit of a general talk about the overview of Pfizer as a corporation. We'll briefly touch on the vaccine and what's going on in that department, and we'll give a little bit of a summary regarding some past unethical behaviors and practices and some criminal activity from Pfizer itself as a corporation. So we're going to get to that, and then after we go through that, we'll go to the news just like a regular show. So it may be a little bit of a long show tonight, and you're of course welcome to stay for as long or as little as you like. Now, this is a little bit of a different format, so if you see that I'm a little bit hesitant, it's because I'm looking back and forward at the screen. I'm using new software, kind of wondering if it's all working, because Facebook is a little bit different from the software I'm using here. So we're actually streaming simultaneously to YouTube and to Twitter right now, and I have an external chat program where I can monitor the comments from both channels to see how it's going. So I can see some people starting to tune in right now. It looks like we've got a few people watching on YouTube and a couple of people watching on Twitter. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the show. As you guys know, the Pfizer vaccine has arrived in Australia and the government is really eager to roll it out. So I think that it's really fitting that we release this information, as in we'll release the bulk of it on Sunday, and we'll talk about it tonight, in order to give consumers the ability to make a proper informed choice. You see, unfortunately, the government and the mainstream media, they have neglected to inform Australians on the past predatory practices of Pfizer. And everybody really needs to be asking the question, which is this a corporation we want to deal with? Is this a corporation that we're happy to consume their products? So we're going to get right to it. Now, I believe it's working now, so if you can share the broadcast, go ahead and share it. If it's a YouTube link, maybe go and post it on your social media or put it on Telegram. And let's just get straight to it. So yeah, I'd like to welcome everyone to the show. I appreciate you being here. All right, rightio. So yeah, Pfizer, the company in question, Pfizer's been around for a very long time, ladies and gentlemen, about 150 years. In that time, of course, they've built themselves into the biggest pharmaceutical corporation in the world. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the company, and then we'll get started with the other main details. All right, so according to Forbes, Pfizer is the 49th largest public company in the world with a market value of $212.8 billion US. Now, to put that in perspective, if Pfizer was a country, if we're looking at GDP, Pfizer would come in just above Qatar at rank 53. If we're looking at, say, Pfizer's market value versus the GDP of Qatar right here, which is 204.1 billion. So what that means is that Pfizer is essentially more valuable than roughly 75% of countries in the world. Their buying power is immense. Their political power is like something that very few corporations or industries have. In other words, Pfizer has what it takes. They have the power, they have the political capital to influence legislation in their advantage, and they've been doing this for a very long time, and this is very much part of their business model, which is lobbying governments in order to influence legislation and policy that best serves the corporate objectives of Pfizer as an organization. And what you're looking at right here is US Congress. So Pfizer routinely spends millions of dollars lobbying US lawmakers. In 2019, the figure reported was $11 million. And as I just mentioned, they do so for the objectives of profits. And I argue they do so for profits over public health and over any type of genuine care for people's health and safety. That's my opinion, of course. Now, what we have here is that Pfizer, in collaboration with BioNTech, is seeking to produce 1.3 billion doses of the vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccine, in 2021. And very well, they could be looking at more than that. And what does that mean for Pfizer, should it all be successful? It means huge profits. Okay, so this was reported on February 4th from news.com.au via the New York Post. Pfizer expects 20 billion in COVID-19 vaccine sales in 2021, and I'm sure they'd like a lot more. I'm sure the shareholders of Pfizer are sitting in anticipation of reaping huge rewards, huge financial rewards, to the likes of which very few people will ever see. So the last thing Pfizer wants, for example, is for some type of, say, cheap alternative, some sort of cheap alternative COVID remedy to hit the market that could potentially disrupt their sales. All right, so I can see that the chat is working now. I can see some of you tuned in from Twitter, some of you tuned in from YouTube, and I'd like to welcome everyone, and I'm glad that this is underway. Anyway, let's keep this rolling. This is from the Western Journal. Many of you are aware that Pfizer, along with the other COVID-19 vaccine companies, have immunity from COVID vaccine liability. So we know that it's too early to determine exactly what immunity people will receive from taking this vaccine, but we do know without a shadow of a doubt that these organizations are immune from liability should a consumer of theirs sustain some type of injury or death. You can't sue them. So that to me suggests that overall these companies are not confident and are not standing behind their products. Now, this individual right here is the CEO of Pfizer. This is Albert Bourla, an individual who, in my opinion, has acted in a very questionable way in the months leading up to the Pfizer vaccine rollout. If you look to the top left of your screen, you'll see that he sold 5.6 million in stock the day he announced promising vaccine use. So that was the day they announced the ultra high efficacy rates of the vaccine, which of course has only undergone a few months of clinical trials as opposed to the usual process that takes years. Now, it's important to note that when Albert sold his shares, he did so when the share price of Pfizer was just about to hit its all-time high. Okay, so he said that it was due to some type of automatic trading arrangement that he has. But in my view, I see a man, a CEO, selling the shares of his company as somebody who is not confident. That's my interpretation. Now, you would figure if one was confident in his product, he'd want to hold on to his shares. They have 1.3 billion doses. Their projected profits that they're stating are huge. So why would you not, if you're the CEO of this organization, hold on to your shares and reap those rewards? Maybe this man's not confident. In fact, he even said the other day that he's not in a rush to get the vaccine, that he's willing to wait for other people to get the vaccine before he goes along and gets inoculated. I would not suspect that that's the type of confidence we would expect from a CEO that is essentially asking the entire world to trust him and his organization. All right, so moving on here, this is the statistics. These are the stats from the CDC Vaccine Adverse Reporting System. We have 653 deaths, 12,044 other injuries. Now, these figures are not totally conclusive. These figures do not all relate specifically to the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, but many of them do. And it's also important to point out that there could very well be potentially more deaths and more injuries of people after they took these vaccines than what is being currently reported by the CDC. All right, so I'm just going to move along here to the next part of the presentation. I'm just going to open the window and make sure that you guys are here. I can see people tuned in on YouTube, and I can see some people tuned in on Periscope right now. So I'd like to welcome everyone here. I can see Lisa, Blue Silver, let's see, CJ, Selena, Matthew, Kylie. It's great to have you guys here. I can see 60 of you watching right now on YouTube. So thank you for being here. And I can see a couple of you on Twitter as well. So just going to get to the next screen here, ladies and gentlemen. So let's see. Hopefully this is all working the way that I think it should be. All right. So I'm going to summarize now some cases in the past where Pfizer has acted in unethical ways, or allegedly acted in unethical ways, you could say, for the lawsuits that were ruled in favor of Pfizer. Now, it's really important to point out before I start speaking about this, and that is that Pfizer, remember, being a huge corporation worth more than 200 billion US dollars, has the means, has the capital to fight every lawsuit tooth and nail. So you have to ask yourself the question, a company that has a history of lawsuits, a history of lawsuits being filed against them due to personal damages and injury, are able to hire, of course, the best legal team, the best legal counsels, and have an absolute advantage over consumers. Okay, so maybe that's why they wanted to indemnify themselves before the rollout of the COVID vaccine. Perhaps they were worried about a massive class action where the people may rise up and decisively take them down. So I'm going to just go through a few examples here of some of Pfizer's past predatory activity. All right, so here we go from 2012. This is from ethicsage.com. Pfizer admits bribery overseas to gain business. On August 7th, 2012, Pfizer agreed to pay the federal government, this is in America, $60.2 million to settle allegations that its employees bribed doctors and other foreign officials in Europe and Asia to win business and boost sales. The charges against Pfizer were brought under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which bars publicly traded companies from bribing officials in other countries to get or retain business. The Securities and Exchange Commission said that Pfizer's overseas subsidiaries made illegal payments to healthcare workers in China, Italy, Russia, Croatia, and other Eastern European countries. As early as 2001, Pfizer sales representatives tried to conceal the bribes by recording them as legitimate business expenses for travel, entertainment, and marketing purposes, the agency said. Pfizer subsidiaries in several countries had bribery so intertwined in their sales culture that they offered points and bonus programs to improperly reward foreign officials who proved to be their best customers, said Kara Brockmeyer, chief of SEC's Foreign Enforcement Division. Now, these cases are very common. We'll go into some more of these cases in the presentation of Pfizer essentially using methods such as corruption and bribery to push their products into foreign markets. Okay, so here's a very famous lawsuit right here that unfortunately hasn't been resolved for many people who have suffered. These are the Zoloft lawsuits, Zoloft being an antidepressant, one of Pfizer's prime products. So I'm just going to read to you here. And great, I can see that the stream seems to be working as it should be. All right, so here we go here. Zoloft lawsuits claim Pfizer, the drug's manufacturer, failed to warn consumers that its popular antidepressant caused birth defects. A series of unfavorable rulings, as in unfavorable to the people affected, has led to the dismissal or withdrawal of hundreds of Zoloft lawsuits. A class action lawsuit claiming consumers were misled about Zoloft's effectiveness was also dismissed in 2014. So you need to ask yourself the question, was the lawsuit dismissed because there was not sufficient evidence? Or was it dismissed because Pfizer has unlimited pockets and is able to purchase the most vicious and aggressive legal teams that money can buy? It goes on to say here, quote, Pfizer has won repeated court victories against people who sued over injuries they said they were caused by top-selling antidepressant Zoloft. Judges have ruled that companies failed to prove that Zoloft caused the birth defects. Now, there's a history of Zoloft litigation. I won't get too much into it, but it says here, since Zoloft was approved in 1991, hundreds of people have sued Pfizer, claiming the drug was dangerous to unborn children or that it didn't work as claimed to treat depression. Now, are these hundreds of people all making it up? Are they all collaborating to take down Pfizer? This is a basic question that you can ask yourself. As we can see here, unfortunately, the class action was dismissed. Now, some of the side effects that were alleged by the complaints were autism, club feet, spina bifida, and arterial septal deficits. So a lot of very bad conditions, a lot that affected the spine, certain conditions that affected the brain. And this is something that is going to be ongoing for a long time, and we hope that people who were allegedly affected can get some justice. But this is not something that is obscure to Pfizer. Here's another example of some similar circumstances in the Ethics lawsuit right here. So here we go. I'll just give you a brief description. Another Pfizer product. This is an antidepressant that may cause a number of serious side effects, and this is from drugdangers.com. Side effects and may cause birth defects. Again, with the birth defects, drug maker Pfizer has faced multiple ethics lawsuits filed by patients or loved ones of those who took Pfizer and experienced serious injury, birth defects, or death. It says here, quote, that Pfizer is an antidepressant medication which is used to treat major depression and anxiety disorders. It was the first serotonin inhibitor and works by increasing activity of serotonin in certain areas of the brain. And you can read a little bit more about the lawsuit claims here. I'll post this up. I was going to say I'll post it on Facebook, but Facebook's blocked news articles. So I'll post it on Telegram. So you can follow me on Telegram at Morgan C. Jonas, because I think it's really important to hear what these victims were saying, because they're stating that they weren't warned about these side effects. And they're alleging, not one person, many people, hundreds, and in some cases thousands of people, that they were not properly informed of the risks of taking these drugs produced by Pfizer. So what I'm getting at here is, what reason do we have to believe the executive team from Pfizer that there's nothing to be worried about their vaccine? Okay, so some of the claims here: heart defects and malformations, respiratory distress, physical defects such as cleft lip and palate. So this is referring to some birth defects. Really terrible stuff. Now, unfortunately for the people filing these complaints, they still haven't received any justice. It says here that most lawsuits have not been settled and some users may still be at risk or not had their legal claims addressed. All right, so moving on here, I'm just going to check on the chat. I see that everything is working as it should be. I see 80 of you on YouTube, 5 of you on Twitter. A little bit different. We're not on Facebook, but you know what? We need to learn to use other platforms. Okie dokie. Moving on. All right, so here we go right here from 2014. Pfizer to pay $325 million in Neurontin settlement. So Pfizer has agreed to pay $325 million to resolve claims it defrauded insurers and other healthcare benefit providers by marketing Neurontin for unapproved uses. Its second settlement over the epilepsy drug in 6 weeks. It goes on to say here, quote, in a statement, New York-based Pfizer said it did not admit wrongdoing as part of the settlement. The settlement requires approval by Chief Judge Patty Saris of the Boston court. It goes on to say, on April 21st, Pfizer agreed to pay $190 million to settle separate litigation in a federal court of New Jersey in which Neurontin purchasers accused it of taking steps to keep cheaper generic versions of the drug off the market. So we also see allegations of drug price manipulations. And who does that affect? It affects the consumer. Who does it benefit? It benefits the bottom line profits of Pfizer. Goes on to say, in May 2004, Pfizer agreed to pay $430 million and pled guilty to criminal charges for illegally, so they finally admitted it, illegally marketing Neurontin for unapproved uses such as migraine, headaches, and pain. So in other words, off-label use, not approved. Okay, so this is not the first time. Pfizer holds the dubious first place of the biggest federal lawsuit in US history. I'm not going to speak about that particular lawsuit, but it's in regards to the off-label promotion of drugs. So basically claiming that one of their products can be used for something that it's not approved for. But I'll get into that on Sunday. I'm going to go through a few more examples. So we have here the notorious case of the proton pump inhibitor, or PPI. This is from drugwatch.com. PPI lawsuits blame the drugs for causing kidney disease, kidney injury, kidney failure, and acute I can't pronounce this word. Interstitial nephris. Okay, you'll have to excuse me. I'm not a medical professional. I'll post the website. You can read it. Excuse my bad pronunciation. Lawsuits against Nexium and other PPI brands, so including Pfizer here, claim manufacturers AstraZeneca, Takeda, and Pfizer failed to warn of the dangers of proton pump inhibitors. More than 15,000 PPI lawsuits have been filed against the manufacturers of prescription versions of these drugs, these brands right here. Now, the lawsuits argue that the manufacturers didn't do enough to warn patients and medical professionals about the possible risks as the companies became aware of them. Okay, this is something that comes up time and time again. Pfizer has been guilty of not warning their consumers of the risks involving the use of their drugs. Some lawsuits allege that AstraZeneca, so here we go, the other company in question, knew of kidney risks for at least 10 years before warning the public. As of 2020, there were So there should be another zero there. 13,400 proton pump inhibitor lawsuits pending in federal court out of a total of 15,164 that had been filed. A judicial panel combined the cases into a multi-district litigation. The number of lawsuits grew quickly, tripling during the first 3 months of 2019 alone. By mid-2019, it had become the second largest mass litigation in the United States. So here are the brands listed in this. Of course, we have Pfizer and AstraZeneca. It says in all these cases, the claim was that the drugs were used to control stomach ache and cause serious side effects that damage kidneys. And it goes on from here. So I'll post this up again. So once again, we see the complaints in relation to side effects and injuries of consuming these products of which they were not informed of by the manufacturer. And we have two manufacturers here that are leading the global charge for the vaccine, Pfizer and AstraZeneca. All right, so here's another example right here. Now, this is a particularly sad example and one, of course, that we'll get into more detail on the show. And I'm glad to see 84 of you here right now. So really sad. This is from Nigeria regarding a clinical trial conducted by Pfizer in the northern state of Kano. So I'm just going to read from you here. Pfizer pays out to Nigerian families of meningitis drug trial victims. Pfizer pays compensation to families of 4 children after a 15-year legal battle over a controversial drug trial in the state of Kano. So that's another thing. Just imagine going through litigation for 15 years. Imagine the emotional strain. Imagine the financial strain. Pfizer can afford to drag these cases out for as long as it takes, hoping that those who complain will simply give up. I'm going to read to you. The parents of 4 Nigerian children who died of meningitis have become the first winners of a 15-year legal battle against Pfizer over a fiercely controversial drug trial. The world's biggest research-based pharmaceutical company, Pfizer, announced on Thursday that it had made payments of $175,000 to each family of the children who died after taking part in the Pfizer trial. $175,000 for the loss of a child's life is, of course, a minuscule amount of money, especially when compared to Pfizer's profits. More such compensation settlements are expected to follow. Now, Pfizer was sued after 11 children died in a clinical trial in the northern state of Kano when it was hit by Africa's worst ever meningitis epidemic in '96. 100 children were given an experimental oral antibiotic called Trovin, while a further 100 received Surfreaxon, the gold standard treatment of modern medicine. 5 children died on Trovin and 6 on the other. But later it was claimed that Pfizer did not have proper consent from parents to use an experimental drug on their children, and questions were raised over the documentation of the trial. So this has been ongoing for, of course, a long time. The state of Nigeria is still seeking compensation today, and as we see, this is in relation to experimental drugs and not providing proper informed consent. So as the old saying goes, the best indicator of future behavior is past behavior. Now, these are a few examples here. I'll have more to come on Sunday. In the meantime, this is a great resource I would like to share with you. And this was sent to me by Serene from Advocate Me. So thank you to Serene. This is peopleforsafevaccines.org. This is a great knowledge base on vaccines and specifically in relation to the COVID vaccines. And this is to help consumers make a better informed decision whether or not they want to take this vaccine. So I'm just going to read to you a little bit from the About Us page here. It goes on to say that we are a not-for-profit company with the following objectives: to promote and encourage safe development, supply and use of human vaccines, to inform, educate and raise public awareness in relation to vaccine safety and efficacy, to take legal action to promote positive vaccine safety outcomes, to do anything related to promoting vaccine safety, efficacy and quality. This includes standing up for the individual's right to choose whether or not to take the COVID-19 vaccines. And we're all very concerned, of course, about the potential for mandates. We are growing a number of people and associations from health and law enforcement sectors and the wider community, namely doctors, nurses, lawyers, police, vaccine injured and ordinary people with a sincere interest in these issues. So I'd like to thank Serene from Advocate Me for bringing this group to my attention. It's a great resource, lots of information here. Go and check it out. That's peopleforsafevaccines.org. Now I'm just going to go back to the broadcast and make sure that we are all connected here. And I can see that we probably are connected. I can see some comments here. There's Seren, there's Melissa, and yeah, I can see a lot of you tuned in right now. So I'm really happy that this is working the way it should. Thank you for being here. Why don't you go ahead and share the broadcast if you can. Of course, this is the Great Migration. You've heard of the Great Reset. Now this is the Great Migration. Thank you, Brian. Brian says you love my work. Thank you for being here. I appreciate each and every one of you. Now that's it for the basic overview on Pfizer. I just want to give a little bit of tidbit of information, and we're going to go into a lot more detail on Sunday. The presentation will probably be pre-recorded, so I can add a few more bells and whistles, but I'll advise you guys of the time and everything like that. All right, now moving on here to the regular news. Now let's get rid of this if we can. All right, regular news time, guys. So, all right, without further ado, we're going to get to it. All right, and all right, we're all good here. You'll have to excuse me if I take a little moment when switching between screens. You see, the more we come along and the more that we build our news show, the more screens we have open at one time, and the more that I need to question if everything's working well. But luckily, it is. And I can see Mishka there in the chat. Mishka, thank you, and thank you for all your great work. We'll be talking about your work on the show really soon as well. All right, so as many of you know, the government and Facebook are involved in this head-to-head battle. I'm going to summarize it really quickly just to break it down. This is from Facebook. This is from a press release. Why you can no longer share or see news on Facebook in Australia. Okay, so unfortunately, in response to Australia's proposed news media bargaining code legislation, Facebook will have to restrict publishers and people in Australia from sharing or viewing Australian and international news content on Facebook. Now, we're all aware of that. People outside of Australia also cannot view or share Australian news content or content from Australian news pages on Facebook. All right, so it goes on to say here that, so people and news organisations are restricted from posting news links. For Australian publishers, this means they are restricted from sharing or posting any content on Facebook pages. Admins will still be able to access these pages from the studio, and they say they'll continue to provide access to all other standard Facebook services, including data tools, etc. So of course, I can still use the live function on Facebook. I can still make posts to advise you of where the show is on other platforms. Of course, my major objective is to build my website, mcjreport.com. As far as I'm concerned, the media has let down the Australian people, and this is one of the driving, motivating factors behind me wanting to build my platform bigger and bigger and to provide more comprehensive news. First, I wanted to, prove and show you guys that we can build a great show, that we can garner interest, and I wanted to iron out the technical difficulties. It seems like we've done that now. It seems like the show is going strong, and I'll tell you that in very due course, we're going to have some great experts on the show, and I'm really looking forward to it. So, what we see here from Josh Frydenberg the other day said that he had a constructive discussion with Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook. He raised a few remaining issues with the government's news media bargaining code, and we agreed to continue our conversation to try and find a pathway forward. So we'll see what happens, right? We'll see what happens. Will the Australian government and Facebook be able to work this out, or will they not? So as you can see, 9 News is like a ghost town, which is probably not the worst thing in the world. ABC News, like a ghost town. Again, probably not the worst thing in the world. 10, same deal. The Australian published this article just the other day. It said, quote, "The tech giant on Thursday followed through on its threats to ban news altogether in Australia and ban users globally from reading any Australian news." It says here that there are severe side effects, right? Severe side effects. We're going to be hearing about a lot of severe side effects. I have a suspicion very, very soon, and I will do my absolute best to cover all of them on the MCJ report. Now, it says here in the Australian, there are signs that the Bureau of Meteorology can't post, that police aren't able to share links to crime alerts or missing persons information, and health agencies aren't able to share news links. It's not just publishers who suffer, it's everyone. Well, basically what this is Facebook sending a message to the Australian government. This is basically Facebook saying, well, listen here, Australian government, we provide you all of these tools which enable you to run your country, such as bombs, such as reporting on the weather, such as police services. Police make posts on Facebook all the time looking for missing people, etc. And Facebook is essentially sending a message to the Australian government in that, well, the Australian government has asked or requested that Facebook compensates them for the hosting of news stories on Facebook. Facebook makes of course, the counter argument that news sources in Australia benefit greatly from being able to access the Facebook social media site. The Australian government says, well, it's not fair because Australian users are now using Facebook as their primary source of news, and Facebook has advertisements. Therefore, Facebook is making all this money, all this profit off Australian Facebook users who are using Facebook to view the news and therefore pay up Facebook, which I can kind of understand. But on the other hand, Facebook's argument is that the government is receiving a huge amount of benefits by having Facebook at its disposal. So who do you think's right and who do you think's wrong? Put that in the comments. I can see where Facebook is coming from. I mean, there's the whole other side of the story, which is Facebook barely pays any tax in Australia. They utilize offshore services, if you will, in order to minimize their taxable income in Australia. So there's also that aspect. Probably Facebook should be paying more tax in Australia. They do make a lot of money off Australian advertisers, but I suppose it is a pretty deep and complex issue. So yeah, it was all reported. You saw it. Facebook news ban hits emergency services and government health departments. All right, so moving on here. Let me just make sure it's all connected, and I believe it is. I'm just gonna go back to the main screen here. I can see 83 of you on YouTube and 3 of you on Twitter. So thank you for being here. Anthony, Craig, Margaret, Lisa, Melissa, Saren. All right, looks like this is working the way it should. I'm almost expecting something to go wrong, but you know what they say, right? Hope for the best, expect the worst. Anyway, let's get back to it. This is an interesting story right here. Local news from Melbourne. Criminal charges could be dropped depending on lockdown legal challenge, court told. Goes on to say, a man accused of inciting others to protest against Victoria's coronavirus restrictions could have his criminal charges dropped if his legal challenge against the state's law is successful in another court, his lawyer says. Tony Pecora, who I've met before actually, appeared before Melbourne Magistrates Court on Tuesday, charged with 2 counts of incitement. Police allege the 43-year-old encouraged others to attend a, quote, walk for freedom at the Royal Botanic Gardens in September last year in contravention of stay-at-home laws. So, we've seen multiple times before that the police selectively enforce the chief health officer's directions. Sometimes protests are okay, sometimes they're not. And it just so happens that the discretionary process that appears to be used by Victoria Police just happens to somewhat fall in line with the ideological, political, socio-outlook of the Premier. Anyway, the article goes on here to state, Mr. Pecora's lawyer, Madeline Smith, had his criminal case adjourned for 4 months while they wait for a listing for a civil trial in the Supreme Court, where Mr. Pecora and others have filed a writ challenging the legalities of Victoria's coronavirus restrictions. Ms. Smith told Magistrate Angela Bolger that the outcome of the Supreme Court proceedings would likely affect Mr. Pecora's case in the Magistrates Court, and it was possible that his charges could be withdrawn by the prosecutors if the higher court ruled in his favour. All right, so we're obviously sending our best wishes to Tony. I think that I can't see how he can sustain a guilty verdict in this court, given the inconsistencies in how the chief health officer's directions are enforced. It seems that if this man is to be brought before a court, then what about Daniel Andrews? If you remember last year, Daniel Andrews actually encouraged the Black Lives Matter rally on his Facebook page. Now, I'm not a legal expert, but one, I imagine, could make the argument that that's a form of incitement. So, if this particular individual is found guilty, Tony, does that mean a precedent will be set and that Daniel Andrews can be arrested and potentially face the same sentence as Tony? What do you think? What do you think? Put that in the comments. All right, moving on here. All right, so Victorian Liberal leader Michael O'Brien he's come out to make a Facebook post on the extension to the state of emergency. Now, I nearly forgot that Michael Bryan actually existed. I never see this guy. Who here sees this guy? You see, during this entire scandal, Michael O'Brien, as far as I'm concerned, has wasted a tremendous opportunity. He could have capitalized on the overreach of the Daniel Andrews government, the disproportionate response to the government, to really build himself up as a champion of the people. But instead, he's been mostly quiet, and Michael Bryan is what I refer to as a garden variety liberal. It seems that there's certain things he can say that fit within the parameters of what the liberals are allowed to talk about, and he won't talk about much else. So I'm going to read this to you right here. This was yesterday afternoon. He said, Daniel Andrews has a bill in Parliament this week to extend Victoria's state of emergency right through 2021, and I think it's a bad idea. I don't think any politician, especially not the current Premier, should have that amount of control over your life. And that's true. Daniel Andrews has unilateral control over our lives. He can shut the lights down. He can lock us in our homes. He can send entire teams of police to shut down businesses. We saw what happened to Al's Gym, right? It looked like police were responding to a terrorist incident. They sent the helicopter. They sent the goon squad. The public order response team. Anyway, he says here, but I want to hear from you. Do you support the government extending the state of emergency powers from 12 months to 21 months? So let's see.
Extend Victoria's state of emergency right throughout 2021. I think it's a bad law, and I'll tell you why. I don't think that any politician, let alone the current Premier, should have that amount of control.
Oh, it's just what he wrote before. I'm not going to bore you with this. All right, moving on here. Moving on to the United States. President Trump, that's right, and I will continue to refer to this man as President Trump, has come out to make some comments regarding social media. So I'm going to read to you here. This is coming from newshub.co.nz. There you go, a New Zealand publication. Donald Trump considering own social media company after Twitter becomes, quote, very boring. The former US president spoke to conservative US media outlet Newsmax on Thursday in one of his first media appearances since handing over office to Joe Biden. During the interview, Trump told anchor Greg Kelly that he was too popular for Twitter to handle. He said, quote, I had 89 million followers, but that was because they held it back. And then on top of that, I had 36 million or 39 million on the POTUS account, the President of the United States account on Twitter. And we had other sites with millions and millions of people. So we had about as big as it gets, and likewise on Facebook. And they all want that, but a lot of the problem is mechanically they can't handle it because it's too many people. It's bigger than they are by many times. And he went on to tell Newsmax that Twitter is nowhere near as exciting, and said his team don't want to go back to Twitter. Instead, he was thinking of starting a rival company. So what do you think of that? Excuse me. Went down the wrong way. So what do you think of that? Would you support a social media platform by Donald Trump? Would you sign up to it? Put that in the comments. All right, moving on here. Moving on to China, and of course, no broadcast would be complete without speaking about China. So Penfolds or Penfolds, that's right. China is producing imitation Australian wine, which is kind of interesting. We've seen the attacks on our economies, our barley, our beef, our dairy, our wine. Chinese people in China have developed a taste and appreciation for Australian wine. But of course, along that comes the production of stolen intellectual property. So here we see in China, we have producers that are stealing the intellectual property trademark of Penfolds, and they've created Penfolds with the same font and the same type of label. Now, unfortunately, this is a trend in China. The consideration for other nations' intellectual property is not considered. It does not occur because through the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party, what they care about is whether or not a product makes money. They don't care who they rip off in the process. So this was spotted in mainland China's supermarket. And I have to say that I commend people in China who actually speak out about it. And not all people in China support the Chinese Communist Party. I'm not going to get off topic too much, but one thing that you won't hear about, because it's largely suppressed, is that protests actually happen in China all the time. Now, the CCP is very quick to shut down protests And I think Victoria Police is taking notes from them. So just know that there are people in China that are still democratically minded that risk their lives to protest the government. So I feel like I should give them that credit. It goes on here to say, imitation Australian wines were found on the shelves of a supermarket in mainland China several months after Beijing authorities imposed anti-dumping measures last year on imports from Australia. Anti-dumping measures. Supposedly, we were sending them too much wine and devaluing the wine market, even though Australian wine is expensive in China and is usually something that is consumed by the upper people in society. The knockoffs carried the label Ben Folds and Pen Funnels, and also carried the words Wine of Australia, right? Because here's the truth of the situation. Since China has stopped buying our products, our agricultural products, our dairy products, our wine, a new black market is emerging in China. New smuggling networks are emerging into China via Hong Kong for Australian products, including but not limited to dairy and beef and wine and grapes. That's right. So there are a lot of free thinkers in China. It may not seem like it due to the iron fist rule of the Chinese Communist Party, but there are. And there's a lot of very savvy people out there in China who are finding new and creative ways to smuggle genuine Australian products into China. You know, when we think of smuggling, we think about drugs and sadly human trafficking. But in China, it is a flourishing black market industry. And the reason for that is simply because our products are amazing. Our agricultural products are the best in the world. I just wish I wish our government would take measures with water infrastructure so that we could cultivate otherwise barren lands throughout Queensland, New South Wales. But anyway, I digress. So there you go. Another rip-off. Businesses in China capitalizing off Australia's hard work. All right, moving on to Europe. 2 journalists sentenced to 2 years in prison for live reporting on a protest. This happened in Belarus regarding protest against the president of Belarus. I'm not going to get into the politics of this particular country. I'm just going to give you a little overview right here. It says, quote, a court in Belarus on Thursday sentenced 2 female journalists to 2 years in prison on charges of violating public order after they covered a protest against the nation's controversial president. The court in the Belarusian capital of Minsk handed a 2-year jail term to both of these particular reporters from the independent media outlet Belsat.tv. It goes on to say here, the United States and the European Union have responded to the Belarus election and the crackdown by introducing sanctions against Belarusian officials. Now, if you were to ask people not all that long ago, no one would think this type of action would be possible in Australia. But of course, we see the heavy-handedness of Victoria Police and the dictatorial leadership qualities of Daniel Andrews, who has the unilateral power to shut Victoria down, and the police who act on his behalf. It's entirely within the realm of possibility that Australia will go down this path as well. So hopefully these journalists get some justice, and I think these stories from all around the world should serve as a major kick up the bum to us in Australia that we need to get our act together and we need to become more involved in politics. We see the new political movement with RDA and Sanjeev playing a huge role in that. Sanjeev, the former Treasury economist. What we need to see are more Australians getting more involved in politics and challenging the seats of politicians who have had it too good for too long. I think unless we can take control of our country politically, these types of scenes, journalists arrested, will become commonplace in our country. So anyway, maybe you have some thoughts about that. Put that in the comments. All right, so what do we have here? Moving on to the United States. Waitress says she was fired from a New York City eatery for not getting a COVID vaccine. We're going to see these stories, unfortunately, popping up time and time again. So I'm going to read this to you right here. Let's see. A New York City waitress says she was fired from a popular Brooklyn restaurant after choosing not to get the COVID-19 vaccine for fear it might hurt her chances of getting pregnant. Bonnie Jacobson, 34 years old, told the Post that the management at Red Hook Tavern canned her on Monday because she balked at getting the shot immediately. She said, quote, "It was shocking to me," she said on Wednesday. "I went through the stages. I'm hurt, I'm in shock, and then I got mad." So there's the cafe right there. Now, this is obviously a clear violation of somebody's personal dignity. I think we can all agree that nobody should be punished should they choose not to inject a certain drug into their body. Now, unfortunately, these types of cases are going to show up more and more, and we see the signs of that encroaching very, very rapidly. So moving on to Israel. Israel to bar unvaccinated people from some jobs, says health minister. So this is happening all over the world. Israel's health minister has confirmed the country plans to stop unvaccinated people from working in certain jobs, but failed to elaborate on what they might be, adding anyone found forging vaccine certificates will be jailed. So it's perfectly okay for the government there in Israel to force their citizens to take the vaccine, to inject something into their bodies, but forge a certificate, you're going to jail. I think it's the government officials that should be going to jail. It says here, quote, "There will soon be jobs where in order to work, the workers will have to either be vaccinated or undergo a COVID-19 test every 48 hours, which is ridiculous." Flanked by senior ministry health officials, Edelstein did not elaborate on which jobs it would be excluded from. It goes on to say, quote, "The vaccinated and those people who have had the virus will be able to go to gyms, concerts, hotels, synagogues from Sunday," the minister has stated, as he discussed the impact of Israel's green pass. A green pass, I mean, you got to love the language that's used. Green, I guess, is associated with something that's natural, yet it's in relation to putting something completely unnatural in your body, something that does not occur in nature in your body. System which comes into force on February 21. All right, so yeah, it looks like many of the citizens in Israel are going to be doing it tough with that. Moving back to Australia, coronavirus vaccines may be made mandatory for aged care workers. This was published by 9 News, and this was published yesterday. It says here, quote, "The Australian government has not ruled out making coronavirus vaccines mandatory for workers in aged care centres. Health Department Secretary Brendan Murphy said mandatory vaccination was something Australia Committee of Chief Health Officers was, quote, considering on a regular basis." Went on to say, quote, "We are waiting until we have the data on the transmissibility of the virus in vaccinated people." So in other words, they're waiting to see what happens with the vaccine. They know, we went through the TGA's website the other day, which implied the TGA is very confident about the vaccine, but then also said it would be monitoring essentially adverse reactions, because we all know the trials only were carried out over a few months, and essentially this is the trial right now. So it's very sad, and I think unfortunately a lot of elderly people feel that they need to take the vaccine. I'm going to play this little clip here right now.
And 91-year-old June Bale is ready.
Who looks forward to need us? Nobody.
At her aged care home in Woonona, she's managed to stay healthy, and now the odds are even better.
It's been really hard during this time. It's been closed so many times and not being able to see them for weeks on end.
909 lives have been lost during the pandemic, and the bulk have been older Australians in aged care. But now, more than a year on, fear has turned to hope.
We are about to start the single biggest and most complex vaccination task in the history of this nation.
From Monday, teams of nurses will be sent into 240 aged care facilities in 190 towns and cities.
What's next? Sending teams door to door. You know, it's pretty interesting to point out that the news will make bold assertions that groups of people or certain people died from COVID without providing any evidence. But of course, when we see people who died after taking the COVID vaccine, there's always an excuse. There's always, well, this person had underlying health issues. This person was old. This person had a delayed immune response, or this person had something else. So unfortunately, I think the media is playing us all for fools. Anyway, put that in the comments. We also see that there is a trend with people who die after taking the COVID-19 vaccine, that they are, a lot of them, elderly people, senior citizens. So it appears to me that unfortunately many people in Australia, many senior citizens, have probably not been made aware of this trend, which is disgraceful, unethical, and I think people should be jailed for this. Anyway, put your thoughts in the comments below. Moving on here. more anti-vax discrimination. That's right, more pro-mandatory vaccines. This time coming from the Pope himself in the Vatican. That's right. From the Associated Press, anti-vax at the Vatican, you might lose your job. It goes on to say here, the Vatican is taking Pope Francis's pro-vaccine stance very seriously. I wonder what Pope Francis thinks about a certain synthesized ingredient in vaccines that originally came from aborted fetal cells. Okay, we know that that's not a conspiracy. You can go and read about that on the internet. I wonder what Pope Francis thinks about that. Anyway, it goes on to say here, Pope Francis has got the pro-vaccine stance. He takes it very seriously. It says here, any Vatican employee who refuses to get the coronavirus shot without a valid medical reason risks being fired. At February 8th, decree signed by the governor of the Vatican city-state says the employees who opt out of vaccination without a proven medical reason could be subject to a sanction up to and including the interruption of the relationship of employment. Yeah, that's right. It goes on to say here that the directive cited the need to protect Vatican employees in the workplace, as well as guidelines issued by Francis's advisory COVID-19 commission, which said individuals have a, quote, moral responsibility to get vaccinated. So there you go, even the Pope enforcing employment-based terms that are dependent on COVID vaccination. All right, moving on to the United States and moving back to China and economics. China overtakes America as European Union's top trading partner. That's right. Goes on to say here, the Chinese state overtook the United States as the European Union's top trading partner in 2020 as ties between Brussels and the communist dictatorship in Beijing continue to deepen. So it's also important to point out that as ties between Europe and China, quote, continue to deepen, ties between Europe and Taiwan continue to be broken apart. Taiwan being a democratic nation that is currently on the verge of being militarily overrun by China. So whatever happened to any form of camaraderie, dealing with nations that have a similar worldview to us of democracy and freedom? It seems that commerce takes precedence. Anyway, it says here, quote, during the year in which the coronavirus pandemic was inflicted upon the world through the ineptitude and malevolence of the Chinese Communist Party, imports from China to the European Union rose by 5.6% and exports of EU goods to China climbed by 2.2%. Goes on to say, the shift in trade reliance means that for the first time, China has topped America as the EU's chief trading partner. Goes on to say, European Union leaders are typically reticent to be overly critical of the CCP, yet they did not shy away from criticizing the America First trade war carried out by the Trump administration against China, which to date has been one of the more aggressive actions taken against the communist government by any American president. So there you go. It's all about the money. It's not about the human rights. It's not about protecting your sovereignty. It's not about safeguarding citizens from the ever-growing Chinese Communist Party sphere of influence, which naturally expands the greater degree to which China intertwines its economies with other economies. It's all geared so that certain businesses and governments can enrich themselves at a tremendous national security cost to the population. So moving on here, this is also in the United States. GOP, which is the Republican Party, urges Biden to resubmit rule imposing transparency on Confucius Institutes. Now, who here is aware of the Chinese Communist Party's Confucius Institutes? We have many in Australia, and there's many of these around the world. Basically what it is what China refers to as an educational program whereby the CCP establishes these educational institutes around the world in schools and universities for the purpose of infecting foreign students with Chinese Communist Party propaganda. Now they say that no, it's about understanding China, it's about understanding China's history and where we've come from. Well, the cat's out of the bag now. Confucius Institutes are being investigated all over the world for subversive objectives such as spreading propaganda, spying, and also poaching talent from other countries. We've got programs here in Australia where students via the Confucius Institute travel to China and learn about Chinese communism and come back to Australia with a fire lit under their belly to advance the geopolitical interests of the Chinese Communist Party. This has been going on for so long. The University of Queensland is highly guilty in this particular regard as well, with their ties to the CCP, their Confucius Institute, and they actually expelled a student, Drew Pavlo, for speaking out against it. So this article says here, quote, Republican Party leaders are urging President Biden to resubmit a recently withdrawn rule that would have required US universities and K-2 schools with foreign exchange programs to disclose any financial ties or connections to the Chinese state-run Confucius Institute, which is simply a matter of common sense. It's simply a matter of national security. Now, you need to think about it like this. China would not allow us to set up some type of Australian education institute in China and to teach Chinese students about Australian values, democracy, free speech, even though we're losing them more and more by the day. So why should we allow China to expand their sphere of influence into Australia via these subversive institutions? You see, China is a true expansionist power, and it is so on many fronts. We have the economic industrial front through operations such as the Belt and Road Initiative. We have political influence campaigns where China wines and dines officials from other countries and looks for weak links in order to promote their commercial global ambitions, weak links that can be potentially compromised, people like Daniel Andrews, for instance. But there is also the cultural objectives as well, and this ties into China's ambitions of becoming the world's dominant hegemon, being the most, which includes, being the most dominant maritime power, controlling the trading routes, but also spreading their propaganda and worldview to all of the countries in which they have commercial interests. So it's not enough that we can just trade with them back and forth, like India, for example. India is not an expansionist country. India is not trying to export its worldview. But China is. It's not enough for them to engage in commercial activities and trade. They want to fundamentally change our societies. And they do so via many different methods. Once we see countries around the world that become dependent on Chinese finance, especially a lot of the small nations, a lot of the poor nations, say throughout the South Pacific, throughout Africa, and all of a sudden these nations become silent on China's human rights abuses of its minorities. All of a sudden these nations no longer recognize Taiwan as an independent nation. All of a sudden these nations are voting with China in the United Nations, supporting China in the World Health Organization, and allowing Chinese officials to essentially dominate their countries, to overtake ports, to overtake infrastructure. And it's always at the expense of the local workforce and always to the tremendous advantage of the Chinese Communist Party. And here in Australia, we're completely surrounded. The Indo-Pacific is being dominated by China, which kind of leads us to our next point, which I'll get to in a minute, which is the ramping up of military patrols throughout the Indo-Pacific, the South China Sea, around Taiwan. But first, there's a couple of other topics I just want to cover. All right, so here we go here. The infamous Wuhan lab, where whatever this coronavirus is suspected to have leaked from, right? We know that we remember the videos from Wuhan of people dropping in the street. I believe those videos were completely false and were manufactured by the Chinese Communist Party in order to falsely scare the world into adopting the China model of lockdowns and radical testing and ultimately vaccine consumption and so forth. So it says here, the infamous Wuhan lab authorized to receive US taxpayer funding. It goes on to say, the National Institute of Health confirmed Tuesday that the Wuhan Institute of Virology is authorized to receive US taxpayer funding for animal research through January 2024. And this is under Joe Biden. Now, it's important to point out that this funding did continue under President Trump. So we need to recognize that and call out that as well. The research lab in Wuhan is suspected to have caused the COVID-19 pandemic through an accidental lab leak. Accidental? Depends on who you ask. Chinese Communist Party looked like they were cleaning up a crime scene. You know, research papers from the lab were torn up. Doctors that spoke out were thrown in jail. We don't know what happened there, but was it an accident that the doctors were thrown in jail? Was it an accident that the research papers from the Wuhan virology lab were torn up? Did officials from the Chinese Communist Party accidentally go in there, accidentally find the research, accidentally throw it in the bin? I mean, you really have to laugh at some of the language used in these articles anyway. So they'll be receiving $600,000 in US taxpayer funds and even more throughout the years. So isn't that great? United States under Joe Biden, he should have cancelled this. Anyway, moving on to news.com.au. Possible war looming on Australia's doorstep as China ramps up attacks on Taiwan. So if you've been paying attention, China, under what it calls the One China policy, believes that it is entitled to dominate and take control of the democratic nation of Taiwan. A little bit of background. There was a civil war in China in 1949 between the nationalists and the communists. Now, the nationalists were deeply damaged and were left with an extremely depleted military after World War II. From that point, the civil war continued, and ultimately the communists had the upper hand on the nationalists. The nationalists moved to Taiwan and essentially set up what they considered to be the real China in Taiwan. Over the years, we've had better diplomatic relations between Taiwan and China, but China really, over the past couple of decades, has ramped up a lot their rhetoric in their goals and their ambitions to bring Taiwan under the banner of China. And unfortunately, over the decades, due to China's economic rise and China's ability to make certain corporations and governments rich around the world, less and less nations today currently recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation. I believe it's probably 15 nations today that still recognize Taiwan as its own nation. And one of the major terms for China doing these Belt and Road initiatives with various corrupt and small economies is they recognize, is that they resist from recognizing Taiwan as its own country. China's been extremely belligerent militarily in Taiwan's sovereign waters. We see the constant patrolling of fighter jets around Taiwan. We see military patrols of warships around Taiwan. They're often intercepted by the Taiwanese Air Force. We see in many cases the US also flying into Taiwanese airspace to counter the Chinese military belligerence in the area. But President Xi has made no bones about it. His words have been very clear, and that is that China will take Taiwan by force. Now, do you believe him or do you not? I suppose what it really comes down to is the Joe Biden administration, the US military. Will Joe Biden continue President Trump's routine of emboldening, empowering, and investing in the US military? Or will he take a back step and allow China to gain a potential military advantage over the United States? I don't have the answer to that question. Maybe you've got your own thoughts and you can put that in the comment below. I'm going to read a little bit from this article here. It says here, quote, "A severe crisis could be brewing in 2021 as superpowers China and the US increasingly clash over tiny Taiwan, potentially leaving Australia exposed." Well, I'll tell you what what will make us really exposed is should the United States crumble, should the United States military crumble, and should China take the number one place in the world as the number one maritime power and military power, then I would say we're pretty screwed. Okay, anyway, according to the Council of Foreign Relations annual preventative priorities survey of foreign policy, experts on potential geopolitical risks in the coming year, the battle between US and China over Taiwan has risen to a, quote, top-tier conflict for the first time in the survey's 13-year history. The findings reflects heightened concern over the growing risk of military confrontation between major powers following intensifying political and economic pressure from China against Taiwan. There is President Xi himself. So, in my opinion, we should be deepening ties with Taiwan. China has shown that on a whim, they're happy to lash out at Australia. They've launched this relentless attack on our economy, obviously with our barley, our beef, our coal, holding up our coal ships off Chinese waters. Taiwan is a democracy. They have similar values to us. They oppose the Chinese Communist Party. Many people believe that Taiwan is the real China, and I echo those sentiments. All right, so there's that. And it certainly seems that since the inauguration of Joe Biden, China has ramped up its belligerence in the area. And considering the new law that was passed by the Chinese Congress last January, which grants authority to the Chinese Coast Guard to open fire on foreign vessels that are traveling within what they consider to be their foreign waters. It's possible we will see a confrontation, but I have my doubts about it. I think that the Chinese military is nowhere near ready for a real confrontation with the United States. You may look at their military size and say, well, China has a big military, why not? But you also need to take into consideration the battle experience between China and the United States. The American army, the whole American military is 100% battle proven, and I would argue that China is not. All right, moving on. Iran-Russia launched joint naval drill in Indian Ocean, report says, and this also includes cooperation with China. All right, so we saw the other day the US aircraft carrier patrols through the South China Sea, an act of dominance in the area, quite possibly in response to China's military activities in Taiwan and around the Senkaku Islands in Japan. And now we see this cooperation between China, Iran, and Russia conducting their own naval exercises in the Indian Ocean, right, which I'm sure that India is not all that happy about. India, of course, having skirmishes with Chinese troops on their northern border. The article goes on to state, the Iranian and Russian militaries have kicked off a joint naval drill in the Indian Ocean aimed at boosting security of maritime trade in the region, Iran State TV reported on Tuesday. The TV said units from Iran's Navy and the powerful Revolutionary Guards naval forces will take part in the exercise dubbed Iran-Russia Maritime Security Belt 2021 in the northern part of the Indian Ocean, spanning a stretch of about 10,600 miles. All right, so this is a strategic place in the world. Throughout these trading routes travels huge amounts of oil from the Middle East to the world. So, of course, there is a tremendous amount of power in controlling this particular region. So what will the United States do? Will the United States sit back and allow this to happen? Well, we've seen activity already. This was from the other day. Two US Navy aircraft carriers conduct South China Sea drills. So China comes out, makes the announcement, hey, come into our waters and we'll shoot you. So the US sends 2 Navy aircraft carriers. And not a single shot has been fired. So is China all talk? Is China posturing? Would China dare open fire on the United States? I don't have the answer to that question. Maybe you do. And also our Navy in Australia, which is good, right? It's nice to see. India, US, Japan, and Australia kick off large naval drills. Now, what do we all have in common here? We're all democracies, right? Says here, quote, India, the United States, Japan, and Australia began their largest joint naval exercises in over a decade on Tuesday. Indian government sources said seen as part of the efforts to balance China's vast military and economic power in the region. So this is all about counterbalance. This is also a display of force. This is sending a message to China that, okay, you can conduct your drills, you can act in a belligerent way in these territories that we don't consider belong to you. We'll show you what we have. So this could be the early warning signs of some type of confrontation. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't have a crystal ball. Okay, so it goes on to say here, the annual Malaba War Games that India holds with the United States and Japan have been expanded to include Australia. All right, go Australia. This year to cover all members of the Quad, an informal group of the 4 largest democracies in the Indo-Pacific. All right, so yeah, the last thing we want is, of course, China to become the world's dominating maritime power, controlling the supply lines, controlling the trading routes, which could lead to the militarization of many islands, many nations in our surroundings, just like what they did to Djibouti. And this is from the Taiwan Strait, just another example. So Taiwan has been making constant reports of Chinese fighter jets entering their airspace, but US aircraft has also entered the Taiwanese defense zone. So usually what happens is China will fly their jets right near the defense zone of Taiwan, and Taiwan, of course, detects this on the radars. They scramble their jets. They jump into action in order to counter China, and sometimes the United States is there as well. So it says here, quote, 6 Chinese fighter aircraft and a US reconnaissance aircraft entered the southwestern corner of Taiwan's air defense identification zone on Sunday, January the 31st. The island's defense ministry said in an unusual admission of US military activity. Tensions have spiked over the last week or so after Taiwan reported multiple Chinese fighters and bombers flying into the zone last weekend in an area close to the Taiwan-controlled Pratas Islands in the northern part of the South China Sea. So it's nice to see America not taking a step back. We were a little bit concerned that under the Biden administration, he would sit back and allow China to do anything that they do. But the question remains, we know about the dealings between Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, and Chinese Communist Party-backed corporations, including hedge funds. Is Joe Biden following the Trump administration policy, the foreign policy in regards to China? And if so, will it continue? Or will we see a lessening of this foreign policy over time? Again, I don't have the answer to that question. Maybe you do. Anyway, I'm just going to go back to the broadcast here and see who's still on. I can see 80 of you on YouTube there. I'm going to read some comments. It seems that you're here with me. CCP supply line is over Myanmar. That's exactly right. And I actually want to talk about the protests that are going on there right now and the degree to which the Chinese Communist Party has a vested interest in the outcome of those protests. There's Linda there saying maybe Prince Philip is sick from his vacation. Right. Fair enough. War is another way for depopulation, says Nickel. Unfortunately, it's true. Unfortunately, sometimes it's necessary though, right? What are the two major reasons for going to war? I would argue that it's for the control of land, supply lines, and resources, right? All of which Australia has, all of which China wants. China is a rising power. China has a huge population, a huge economy. What does a huge population and a huge economy need? They need resources and land. In Australia, we have an abundance of land. We're one of the least densely populated countries on earth. We also have an abundance of natural resources, coal, iron ore, uranium, rare earth elements, nickel, copper, and more. China wants what we have and will go to any length to get it. We should also take note of Indonesia, the small nation of Indonesia that we support to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars through foreign aid. We train their military. China is heavily deepening ties with Indonesia, particularly in the electric vehicle sector. Now, why might that be concerning to us? Indonesia, another rapidly growing economy. You've got a nation that's roughly 10 times smaller than Australia in terms of land mass, with a population roughly 10 times bigger than Australia. So you've got a small country, lots of people, a growing economy, investment from China. Indonesia needs land and resources. They've got a military of more than 400,000 people. So with China occupying nations all around our country, it literally is a situation whereby we're being surrounded. The massive super city in Daru, just 200 kilometers north of Queensland. You know, the dodgy debt trap diplomacy tactics of the Belt and Road Initiative all throughout our region, including New Zealand. Now, ScoMo may have torn up the Belt and Road Initiative, but New Zealand is pushing far ahead with it. So we need to consider that New Zealand could be a proxy for the Chinese Communist Party and a springboard into Australia. Okay, so I think that probably we're going to have to renegotiate our foreign policy with New Zealand, the greater extent to which Jacinda Ardern intertwines the New Zealand economy with China. So anyway, just moving back to the broadcast, that's about it for today. So once again, I'd like to thank Serene from Advocate Me for recommending this website here. Go and check it out. It looks like a great website, a great knowledge base of information. peopleforsafevaccines.org. You can go there and have a read of the information. Again, go ahead and follow me on Telegram. That's at Morgan C. Jonas on Telegram. But perhaps most importantly, go ahead and sign up to my free newsletter. I'll be sending out newsletters on a daily basis. The mainstream media has let down Australia, and my objective is to play a major role in giving Australians an alternative news source. So that just about wraps it up for today. I think we've done pretty well. Let me just check on the chat. I can see that a lot of you are hanging in there right now on YouTube and also on Twitter. So I'd like to thank you all for being here. This is the first time we've gone off Facebook. So I think so far so good. It's been a pretty smooth transition. And that's it for me. So signing out, take care, and I'll see you on Sunday night for a full presentation on Pfizer's corporate rap sheet. Goodbye. Good night.